Sarisa city in modern Pakistan called Multan. It sits in the Punjab province, on the banks of the Chenab River, and it is today a city of approximately 4 million people, its history stretching back further than most cities in the world dare to claim. Its bazaars and its mosques and its shrines to Sufi saints have accumulated over centuries in the specific layered way that ancient cities accumulate, each generation building on the foundations of the one before it, the present resting on the compressed weight of everything that came before. Beneath those foundations, if you could reach back far enough through the archaeology of the place, you would find the level that corresponds to the winter of 326 BCE, when a 29-year-old Macedonian king who had already conquered everything between Greece and India arrived at the walls of the city that then stood on the site, a city called Multan by its Malli inhabitants, and he conducted what his own commanders and his own biographers subsequently identified as the most reckless, the most costly, and in several of its key moments the most extraordinary act of personal courage we performed in a military career that was entirely composed of extraordinary acts. Alexander the Great's assault on the Malli city is not the most famous of his battles. Gaugamela, where he broke the Persian Empire, is more famous. The Granichus, where he established his reputation in the very first engagement of the Persian campaign, is more famous. The Hydaspes, where he defeated the Indian king Porus and his war elephants, is more famous. The Malli campaign is the battle that people who know Alexander's history know, but that people who know only the popular myth of Alexander have often not heard of. That obscurity is itself informative. The Malli campaign does not fit the triumphalist narrative of Alexander's conquests as neatly as the famous victories do. It was a campaign that very nearly killed him, and that did kill thousands of his soldiers in circumstances that were not glorious. It was a campaign that was conducted in the context of an army that was exhausted, demoralized, and in the specific state of near mutiny that had forced Alexander to turn back from his intended advance deeper into India at the Hypasis River. It was a campaign that revealed, in ways that the more famous battles do not, the specific quality of Alexander's personal psychology at a point in his career, where the distinction between military genius and the self-destructive compulsion had become genuinely difficult to draw. This is the story of the Malli campaign, the most brutal battle of Alexander's life, the battle he almost didn't survive, and the battle that tells you something about what Alexander actually was that the famous victories cannot. To understand the Malli campaign, you have to understand what had happened in the months immediately preceding it and the specific state of Alexander's army and Alexander's psychology in the autumn of 326 BCE. The Indian campaign had been going for over a year. The army had crossed the Indus, defeated Porus at the Hydaspes, and continued eastward to the Punjab in conditions of monsoon rain and heat that were genuinely novel and genuinely horrible for a Macedonian force that had spent years fighting in the familiar climate zones of the Mediterranean world and Persia. The monsoon season of 326 BCE, with its continuous rain, flooding rivers, rotting equipment, and the specific misery of soldiers whose armor was rusting, and whose food was spoiling, and whose diseases were multiplying, was the immediate context for what happened at the Hypasis River. The mutiny, which is what it was even though Alexander's historians carefully described it as a collective petition rather than a refusal of orders, happened at the Hypasis River in approximately July 326 BCE. Alexander's army refused to go further east. The men had been on campaign for 8 years, had marched over 17,000 miles from Macedonia, had fought in terrain ranging from the mountains of Afghanistan to the plains of India, and they had reached a collective and irreversible conclusion that they would go no more further. The king could go east alone if he wished. They were going home. The precise form that the refusal took is described differently in different ancient sources. Arrian, the most reliable of Alexander's biographers, describes a scene in which Alexander retired to his tent for 3 days in the hope that his army would relent, a form of emotional pressure that had worked on previous occasions when Alexander had used it. It did not work this time. The omens that his seers found unfavorable for the crossing, following his 3-day sulk, provided the institutional face-saving mechanism that allowed Alexander to announce that the gods had instructed a return without acknowledging that his soldiers had refused to follow him. The return was ordered. The altars were built on the Hippasis to mark the furthest extent of the campaign. And the Alexander, deeply humiliated in a way that the sources acknowledge even if they do not always analyze, turned his army south toward the sea. The southward march was not a retreat. Alexander could not conceive of anything he did as a retreat. It was a campaign, with no enemies and no objectives and the specific strategic purpose of establishing control of the industry for route to the sea that would eventually connect the Eastern Empire to the Western Empire through maritime trade. It was also, and this element is visible in every account of what followed, an opportunity to inflict military violence on a scale and with an intensity that the Hippasis humiliation had created a need for. The Malli and the Ostrakray were the two most powerful peoples of the lower Punjab, occupants of the territory between the Hydaspes and the Indus rivers that Alexander's southward march would traverse. They were ancient enemies of each other, the two peoples having fought for generations over the fertile territory of the Punjab, and their enmity had made them strategically stupid in the specific way that long-standing local rivalries make politics strategically stupid. Each side more concerned with its position relative to the other than with the external threat that was now approaching them with an army that had just defeated everything from Greece to the edge of the known world. When word arrived of Alexander's approach, the Malli and the Ostrakray did the sensible thing. They set aside their mutual hostility and began to coordinate their defense, sending messages and the ambassadors and beginning the process of military preparation that a threat of this magnitude required. They had approximately 90 Komando fighting men between them, a significant force, and the terrain of the Punjab, with its rivers and its walled cities and its specific geography, offered defensive advantages that had allowed the peoples of this region to resist previous aggressors. Alexander did not give them the time to prepare. The specific virtue of the Malli campaign, from a purely military technical perspective, is the operational speed with which Alexander moved. Having learned of the Malli-Ostrakray coalition through his intelligence sources, he made the decision to attack the Malli first, before they could complete their junction with the Ostrakray, and to do so by moving across the Sahara Desert between the Hydaspes and the Ravi rivers, a route that the Malli did not expect an army to use because the desert conditions of the Mat were genuinely horrific. The desert crossing was conducted in the winter of 326 to 325 BC, across terrain that was not technically desert in the modern sense but was the specific semi-arid scrubland of the Punjab winter, its water sources limited and its distances long enough to strain the logistics of an army that was already operating at the extended end of its supply chain. Alexander force-marched his army across this terrain in a crossing that the ancient sources describe as extraordinarily rapid, approximately 200 kilometers in approximately 3 days, a rate that required the kind of sustained physical effort that only an army, whose discipline is maintained by the specific combination of professional identity and the personality of its commander, could achieve. The Malli, who had based their defensive planning on the assumption that Alexander would approach along the river routes where his logistics could be more easily maintained, were caught completely off balance. The first major settlement to fall, captured before the city's population had finished evacuating, contained a significant number of Malli soldiers who were killed in the assault and a larger number of civilians who were killed or enslaved in the specific way that Alexander's campaigns dealt with populations that had not submitted before his arrival. The ancient sources record these killings with a matter-of-fact precision that reflects the norms of ancient warfare without suggesting that the participants found them morally problematic. The campaign continued south and east, Alexander's forces dividing into multiple columns that converged on the Malli territory from different directions simultaneously. A classic pincer strategy that prevented the Malli from concentrating their forces and forced them to choose between defending multiple points or abandoning some of them. The strategy worked in its operational objectives and produced enormous casualties among the Malli population and the military forces, but it was not producing the decisive engagement that Alexander needed. The one great battle in which the Malli military capacity would be conclusively destroyed. The decisive engagement was forced at a major Malli city on the Rafi River, a heavily fortified settlement that the Malli had withdrawn to in large numbers after the failure of their attempts to resist the Macedonian advance in open country. The city's defensive walls were strong and its population was determined, and Alexander's assault on it produced the specific circumstances of the most dangerous moment of his entire military career. The assault was conducted in the standard Macedonian fashion, with scaling ladders raised against the city walls and the infantry climbing under cover of missile fire from archers and the javelin throwers. The initial assault made fierce resistance. The Malli defenders on the walls were fighting with the specific desperation of a people who knew what the fall of the city meant for themselves and their families, and the resistance was slowing the assault to the point where Alexander's characteristic impatience with any military situation he was not personally controlling became operative. What happened next is documented in all the major ancient sources, and their accounts differ in some details but agree on the essential sequence of events. Alexander, watching the assault stall, seized the scaling ladder himself, placed it against the wall, and climbed it. He was accompanied initially by his bodyguard Puchestas, who carried the sacred shield taken from the temple of Asin at Troy, that Alexander had carried into battle as a talisman since the beginning of the campaign, and by his friend Leonatus and a soldier named Abreas. Behind these four men, the Macedonian assault troops resumed their climb. Alexander reached the top of the wall and stood on the battlements, fighting the Malli defenders around him with his sword. His position, silhouetted against the sky on the city wall, was visible to both the Macedonian forces below and the Malli defenders above, and it produced contradictory reactions in both groups. The Macedonian soldiers below, seeing their king alone on the wall, accelerated their own climb. But in the press and the panic of the assault, the ladders gave way under the combined weight of 2 men climbing simultaneously. Multiple ladders broke. The assault troops who had been following Alexander fell back to the ground. Alexander was left on top of the wall with 3 companions and an entire city of Malli defenders around him. The 3 men with Alexander were Puchestas, Leonatus, and Abreas. The 4 of them jumped from the battlements into the interior of the city rather than retreating the way they had come. This decision, which could be characterized as tactically suicidal, was in fact the only option available to them. Retreating down the outside of the wall meant retreating toward the Macedonian forces who could not yet follow them, while the Malli defenders on the wall would have time to kill them before they descended. Jumping into the city interior, where they would be immediately surrounded, had the specific advantage of being unpredictable and of placing them in a position where their deaths would require the Malli to risk their own, rather than being simply shut down from the wall. The four men landed inside the city and immediately established a fighting position with their backs against the wall. The specific defensive formation of men who are surrounded and outnumbered but who are trained soldiers with superior weapons and armor fighting against opponents who are initially disorganized by the unexpected nature of the situation. Abrias was killed almost immediately. Pogestas and Leonatus were both wounded, and Alexander was hit by an arrow from a Malli bowman at close range. The arrow entered Alexander's chest below the right shoulder and penetrated deeply, puncturing the right lung. The wound was immediately apparent in its severity, the specific physical response to a lung wound visible to everyone present, the coughing of blood that indicates pulmonary damage, the difficulty of breathing that accompanies penetrating chest trauma, the specific rapid weakening that massive blood loss from a lung wound produces. Alexander continued fighting despite the wound for as long as he physically could before collapsing against the wall that had been his defensive position. Outside the wall, the Macedonian forces had observed what had happened, and they were now experiencing a collective psychological reaction that produced, in military terms, exactly the result that Alexander's personal recklessness had always threatened to produce but never previously achieved. The king was inside the city, wounded or dead, and they could not reach him. The reaction to this realization was the specific combination of grief, rage, and the removal of all normal military restraint that produces atrocity. The Macedonian assault that followed the breach of the Malli city war after Alexander was wounded inside it is described in the ancient sources in terms that make clear its extraordinary violence. The Macedonians were not conducting a military assault with tactical objectives. They were trying to reach the king and, in the process, killing every Malli person they encountered with the specific fury of men who believed the king was dying and who held the city and its people responsible. The Malli city was taken, and its population was killed with a thoroughness that the ancient sources record without apparent moral concern. In the way that ancient warfare recorded the killing of besieged populations that had resisted rather than surrendered, Alexander was found inside the city, still alive. The arrow had to be removed, and the removal of the arrow is one of the most discussed medical interventions in ancient history, described in detail by the ancient sources in ways that modern medical historians have analyzed for what they reveal about ancient surgical practice and about the specific nature of Alexander's wound. The arrow's shaft was chewed away first, and then the broadhead arrowhead was extracted, an operation that required the wound to be enlarged and that the sources describe as producing a massive outpouring of blood in the eye at the gazer. The specific clinical sign of a penetrating lung wound called a pneumothorax visible even in the pre-scientific terms of the ancient account. Alexander survived the surgery. He recovered, but the recovery took weeks, and during those weeks the army did not know whether he would live. And the specific uncertainty about whether the king was going to survive produced a psychological crisis in the Macedonian force that expressed itself in grief, in anger, and in the specific collective behavior of an army that has been told its commander is dead or dying and that responds by reverting to the specific tribalism of men without clear authority. The wound changed things, not immediately and not completely, but in ways that subsequent events made visible. Alexander was not the same physical specimen after the Malli wound that he had been before it. The lung damage was permanent in ways that ancient medicine could address only partially. The recovery was real, but it was not complete restoration, and the subsequent years of Alexander's life, the years of the return march through Gedrosia and the final years in Babylon, were years in which a man who had been in extraordinary physical condition was managing a body that had been permanently compromised by an arrow through the lung at age 29. The campaign against the Malli and the Ostrich continued after Alexander recovered sufficiently to return to command. The Ostrich, who had watched what happened to the Malli, submitted rather than fighting. The lower Punjab was brought under Macedonian control through the combination of military violence and the diplomatic submission that Alexander's campaigns consistently produced. The terror of what happened to those who resisted creating the compliance of those who chose to accommodate. The Indus campaign continued south to the sea, reaching the Indian Ocean at the Indus Delta in approximately July 325 BCE. Alexander stood at the edge of the ocean and he reportedly sacrificed to the gods, specifically to those of the sea. In the specific ritual that recognized the achievement of reaching the sea from the inland empire he had built, he was wounded, recovering, and at the furthest extent of a campaign that his army had forced him to curtail. The moment that the sea was triumphant in its symbolism and bittersweet in its reality. The return march through the Gedrosian desert in modern Baluchistan was the other dark chapter of the Indian campaign and the one that cost more Macedonian lives than any single battle of the entire campaign. The desert killing through thirst and the heat and the exposure rather than through organized enemy resistance. The Gedrosian march was a strategic miscalculation that Alexander made in the specific state of mind of a man who had been prevented from going further into India and who was determined to demonstrate that the return could be made through the most difficult possible route. Because demonstrating the impossible was one of the few remaining means available to him of expressing the compulsive need to exceed human limits that had driven him from Macedonia to the edge of India. The lasting consequences of the Malli campaign extended beyond Alexander's personal wound and beyond the immediate military results of the campaign. The campaign established the specific tone of Macedonian policy toward resistance in the Eastern Empire, a tone of maximum violence applied to maximum speed that produced submission through fear rather than through governance. A policy whose short-term effectiveness was considerable and whose long-term consequences for the stability of the empire that Alexander was building were significant and negative. The men who fought in the Malli campaign, those who survived it, returned to Babylon with Alexander and were present for the final years of his life and for the days that came in June 323 BCE. When Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. The debate about the cause of Alexander's death, typhoid fever, poisoning, alcohol-related organ failure, the long-term effects of his multiple wounds including the Malli arrow, has never been conclusively resolved from the ancient evidence. What is known is that the body that died in Babylon in 323 BCE had been systematically damaged by more than a decade of campaigning, and that the Malli arrow's penetration of the right lung was among the most significant of the accumulated physical insults that the body was managing in its final years. The Malli city itself was rebuilt after the Macedonian assault and continued its existence as a settlement. Its history of destruction and rebuilding, the specific history of cities in contested territory, absorption and survival, and the resumption of ordinary life in the spaces between the extraordinary events that the historical record preserves and the ordinary events that it does not. 2.5 years of subsequent history have left no more visible archaeological monument to the specific days in the winter of 326 BCE when a young Macedonian king climbed a wall and nearly died in the city that now holds 4 million people in a different name. What the Malli campaign tells us about Alexander that the famous victories do not is something about the relationship between greatness and the self-destruction that the historical record consistently approaches but rarely fully articulates. The same qualities that made Alexander capable of military achievements that no more subsequent commander in the ancient world fully replicated also made him capable of climbing a city wall alone with 3 companions when his army could not follow him. Because the alternative, waiting until the ladders were repaired and the assault resumed in an orderly fashion, was not compatible with the specific psychological framework that had brought him from Macedonia to the edge of India in the first place. Greatness and the self-destruction in Alexander are not separate qualities that happen to coexist. They are expressions of the same underlying characteristic, the absolute refusal to accept the limits that circumstances, human physiology, geography, and ultimately an army that had reached the edge of its own endurance tried to impose on what he could do and where he could go. The Hippasus River is where the army stopped him. The Malli city wall is where he tried to stop himself and he failed. The arrow that hit him was not bad luck, it was arithmetic. A man who climbed enough walls would eventually be hit. Alexander understood this at some level. His commanders understood it more clearly and he said so, repeatedly. In the pleading and the reproaches that the ancient sources record them delivering every time Alexander put himself in situations that his tactical role and his strategic importance could not justify, he did not stop. The arrow at Multan was always going to find him somewhere. The remarkable thing is that it did not kill him. Or perhaps the most remarkable thing is that it effectively did, not in the winter of 326 BC, but in the slow wake that a penetrating lung wound in the ancient world. Without antibiotics or modern surgical intervention, does its damage over months and years the body that continues to be subjected to the alcohol, the stress, and the continued physical demands of military command and the political governance. The arrow at Multan found Alexander. He survived it by 6 years. Whether those 6 years were a recovery or an extended dying depends on which evidence you find most persuasive. He was 32 when he died. He had been king for 13 years. He had marched 17,000 miles. He had fought more battles than can be accurately counted and been wounded in most of them. He had built an empire that covered 2 million square miles. And at 29, bleeding from a lung wound in a city in what is now Pakistan, he had been as close to the specific ending that his specific way of living always implied as a man can come and still come back. The war was always going to be the thing, not the battles in the open field where his genius was most fully expressed. The wall, the limitation, the thing that could not be outmaneuvered or outhawed, that simply had to be climbed or not climbed. Alexander climbed walls because Alexander did not accept that there were things he could not do. And at the Malli city in the Punjab winter of 326 BC, the wall fought back.